Hello, my name is Leonard, and this is the Symantec Enterprise Vault 10 for Exchange Administration course, Lesson 11, Configuring and Managing Indexes. We've been alluding in all the lessons previous to this one about the indexing service and what the indexing service does for us. Well, in this lesson, we're finally going to get into the details of what makes up the indexing service and exactly what that's going to do with the indexing engine. So our topics include an introduction to the Enterprise Vault 10 indexing, and this is because we've actually changed the indexing model, moving from a 32-bit indexing engine to a 64-bit indexing engine. So we'll talk about how that change is being implemented. We'll look at configuring the indexing, and then we'll talk about some tools that help us manage the indexes once we've got them set up and running. First, we'll do our introduction to the Enterprise Vault 10 indexing, and after we get done with this lesson, we should be able to describe the structure, architecture of the Enterprise Vault 10 indexing environment. First, we'll just kind of talk about some generic indexing terminology and an overview of the indexing. Each archive has an index that enables the searching of the contents. Once again, the idea here is that we're generating the index so that people can search and then use those search results to retrieve items or perform additional tasks. Each index consists of one or more index volumes. When an index volume is full, it will roll over to a new volume. And this is all handled automatically. The index volumes are stored in index locations. And we've had a couple previous lessons where we talked about configuring the index locations. We'll revisit that here as well. We also are going to be setting up the indexing level, which determines what is being indexed and therefore what can actually be searched. The indexing levels are going to be defined by an administrator, and we'll look at where we configure those at and what the advantages of setting the two different levels of indexing that are going to be available. We're going to look at the ingestion process. This is the process in which the item is actually taken from the storage service once it's been converted into the per user part or the shared part or the converted content part, and how it actually ingests that information to convert it into an index. And as a reminder, as part of your Enterprise Vault environment, you do want to periodically back up your index files, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in a later lesson, which deals with backing up and recovering your Enterprise Vault environment. Let's go through and look at the basic processes that are involved as part of the ingestion of your information in the indexing architecture. The indexing service is going to request the archived items from the storage service. It does this by initially querying the Enterprise Vault directory database and then querying the Vault Store database. The storage service is then going to be responsible for retrieving the items from the Vault Store partition and then passing those converted content files, message bodies, and the attributes to the indexing engine. The indexing service will then index that converted content file, message bodies, and the attributes, and it will then update that with the appropriate index location folder, update that data to the appropriate indexing location. Now, when you're actually searching the index, what is happening? There's going to be a client application that's going to make a call for a search. And there's a variety of different client applications that could be making the call to the search, Archive Explorer, the integrated search, also add-on components such as Compliance Accelerator or Discovery Accelerator. Any one of those can be making a call to perform a search. When we're working with the Enterprise Vault 10 environment, the assumption is that you've probably upgraded from an earlier version of Enterprise Vault, so therefore you're going to have a combination of both 32-bit indexes and 64-bit indexes. If you are a new environment that's never done any archiving before and you're starting off with Enterprise Vault 10, then you do not have to concern yourself with the issues that we discuss here in the 32-bit indexes. But again, we expect that not to be the norm. Most people have been using Enterprise Vault for a while, so they will have performed the upgrade. Now, what will happen is that once that call has been made from the client application to perform a search, we'll generate a federated search, which means we will have the search combine the results from both the 32-bit indexes and the 64-bit indexes. So let's look at the side that deals with the 32-bit indexes. And this is the way that indexing occurred in earlier versions of Enterprise Vault. We would provoke an index broker process, and that index broker process would then spawn individual index server processes for each individual index volume. So in this example, you can see we have a single index broker making 2 index server processes because we're trying to search 2 separate index volumes. In our Enterprise Vault 10 environment, we're going to be making a call to a process, the EV Index Query Server, and that EV Index Query Server will be passing on its request to the 64-bit search engine. There will be a single 64-bit search engine process for however many different 64-bit index volumes you're actually going to be searching. Now, for the index structure, as we mentioned, an index is going to be associated with an individual archive. However, one index can have any number of index volumes. The idea is to minimize or maintain the size of these index volumes to optimize them for searching. That's their primary function, is to respond to searches. So again, you can have one or more index volumes based upon the number of items that you have in fact indexed. Then the individual index volumes will then put the physical files associated with the indexes into index locations. And we'll look at in more detail about how we want to choose those index locations in a little bit later in this particular lesson. Now, what we're trying to show here is that when we're going between the index through the index volume object to the index location object, there's going to be the indexing service that's going to determine which index volumes go to which index locations, and it's going to make this determination basically using a round-robin type of an environment. So in this example here, we have the top index volume currently going to the H drive in index 1 folder, and then the bottom 2 index volumes are going to the I drive and to an index folder 6. And we'll see that structure physically in the Windows Explorer type of an environment in just a moment. But it'll go through, and these index volumes may not constantly be writing to the same index location. And it'll be associated as we open additional index volumes once one index volume fills up and closes. Looking at that index location overview, again, when you separate or create the actual index location, you're going to specify a folder name. And in this case here, we've created a folder called EV Storage that's going to be responsible for maintaining the location for the server-side cache, as well as a folder for the indexes. So each one of the individual indexes, we have 8 separate index folders, and that's because by default, when you specified the index locations way back in Lesson 3, it by default will specify or give you 8 different index locations. In each one of these individual index locations, we will have a subfolder based upon the index volume. The first index volume will just have a archive ID associated with it. When that index volume rolls over, it will then add a number to the end of it. As we go through and looking at these individual locations can either be closed or open. If a particular index volume and location has been closed, I will no longer write active data to that index volume. It doesn't mean that I can't delete items or update metadata. I just don't put any new items in there. When I go into backup mode, it will prevent any modification or updates to both open and closed index locations, and we'll discuss that concept of a backup mode when we get into a later lesson for backup and recovery. However, even if I am in backup mode or if an index volume is closed, I can still go through and search that item. So regardless of the status, open or closed, or being in backup mode, I still have the ability to search that index. That's that importance of being able to search the indexes themselves. So when we are deciding on an index location, some best practices to follow: make sure that you do exclude all of your index locations from both real-time and scheduled antivirus scans. This is to prevent an antivirus software from modifying one of these index location files and then preventing us from being able to search that index, making it corrupt. We want to disable opportunistic locking on the Enterprise Vault server. We want to set the page file according to the Symantec recommended guidelines. And currently, that recommended guideline is at least 1.5 times the installed RAM on the Enterprise Vault server. And then for the actual location, we recommend that you use a RAID 1 plus 0 type of a disk operation on either local or fiber attached SAN network. We do not recommend using a optical device, Centera, or other warm storage devices. And this is because, again, this index data can constantly be updated. So you don't want to put it on a device that is only designed to be written to once. Also, do not place your index location on any other spindle or logical unit number that has other input-output intensive types of applications, such as Exchange Server, Store, or the SQL Server. And then if you are using a NetApp device for your index location, make sure that you have turned off the opportunistic locking on the NetApp device as well. So let's look at the indexing level. The indexing level determines what is actually going to be indexed by the indexing engine, as well as determining what's going to be searchable. We have two different levels of indexing in Enterprise Vault 10. We have brief and full. First, we're going to look at the items that are archived for brief. This is going to include the metadata associated with the particular item, which includes typical things such as the author, recipient, expiration date, retention category, original location. However, it does not contain the actual content. If you wish to have the content stored, you need to change the indexing level to full. With full, you get everything that you got in brief, as well as being able to do content and phrase searching. If this particular index is going to be indexing a journal archive, or if you know you're going to be doing compliance accelerator or discovery accelerator searches of the mailbox or journal archive, we highly recommend that you select full for your indexing level. Now, of course, this comes with a certain amount of overhead. For mail items, if I select brief for the indexing level, whatever the original size of the mail item, I have to add an additional 5% size for the index locations, and whatever the original size of the mail item was, and I select full, I have to allow an additional 12% for the index size for that type of indexing. Also, when you're determining this, do consider backing them up as far as the time it's going to take to back up the index locations. Now, moving on with Enterprise Vault 10, we've introduced some new concepts because of the 64-bit indexing engine. So along with these concepts, we've come up with some additional terms and definitions that we need to make sure that when we discuss or use these terms that we're talking the same type of items here. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Enterprise Vault server types. One type of Enterprise Vault server can be an indexing-only server. This is an Enterprise Vault server that's running the indexing service. Now, you can have combinations that have indexing and storage, but you can also have Enterprise Vault servers that just service the indexing service, and we're going to call that an index server. The storage server is an Enterprise Vault server running only the storage service. Now, we also have a combination of an all-in-one server, which is an Enterprise Vault server that's running both the indexing and the storage services. The little pop-up there is showing you from the Enterprise Vault Administration Console a little excerpt that is showing the services that are running on a particular Enterprise Vault server. And on this particular server, you can see that it has both the indexing and storage service running. So therefore, this would be considered an all-in-one server. Next thing that's new with Enterprise Vault 10 indexing is the concept of what's called an index server group. The index servers can be grouped together into a logical container called the index server group. These are going to be created to give you the capability of sharing resources for more scalable indexing and searching by allocating the index volumes to different index servers. These index volumes for an individual archive can be hosted by different index servers within the same index server group. To control which archives are indexed by a particular index server, we're going to take the vault stores and associate them with a particular index server group. Now, index servers do not have to be grouped together. We're going to talk about here in a moment when you would want to use an index server group. Not everybody needs it. It's not right for every Enterprise Vault environment. If I do not have an indexing server in an index server group, we're going to call that an ungrouped server. If I have an ungrouped server, it will not share resources with an index server group. And if I do not install the storage service on that particular index server to make it an all-in-one server, indexing will not occur. If I have an indexing service and a storage service on a single Enterprise Vault server, that's going to act as it did in Enterprise Vault 9. As we mentioned, part of determining which archives are going to be associated with an index server group, which will control which index volumes are going to be associated with an index server group, we're going to relate the Vault store to the index server group. So the storage and indexing services can be distributed, and you can set up a storage-only and an indexing-only server. And in certain situations, and we're going to discuss those situations here in a moment, this will provide better scalability than having them both on the same server. What indexes the Vault store? Either an ungrouped all-in-one server, or you must associate the Vault store group with an index server group. If a Vault store is not associated with an all-in-one server or an index server group, then nothing in that particular Vault store will be indexed. That's important. If a server is running just the indexing service but not the storage service, it must be a member of an index server group to actually have anything be indexed. Well, now let's get back to this idea of when do I need an index server group. Now, on the slide, I have 5 different options here. If you have only one of them, you probably don't need an index server group. If you have only 2 of them, you may still not need an index server group. If you have 3, 4, 5 of them, then you need to start looking at, I may need an index server group. And in the installing and planning guide, it helps you make this decision. But let's look at some of these different situations that are going to add up to having an index server group. First, in order to have an index server group, you must have more than one Enterprise Vault server. Does that mean that your current Enterprise Vault environment has 2 Enterprise Vault servers? You need to run out and immediately set up index server groups? No, you don't need to do that. If there's an uneven workload across the Enterprise Vault servers in your current environment, maybe you have one Enterprise Vault server that is busy all the time, up to 80 to 100% processor usage, but you have a second Enterprise Vault server that never seems to really get above 30 or 40% processor usage, then you may want to consider that as one of the criteria to point you in the direction of having an index server group. If your environment has more than 5,000 mailbox archives per Enterprise Vault server, again, in conjunction with the other options, that may point you toward an index server group. But if the only thing you have is 5,000 mailbox archives on one server, doesn't mean you have to set up index server groups. If you are doing journal and or file system archiving in conjunction with your mailbox archiving, it with the other situations may lend you towards going with a index server group. And if you're going to be doing very involved searching, such as the needs of a discovery accelerator, which may return ultimately 1 million hits from your Enterprise Vault environment, or the compliance accelerator, because the journal archive is literally journaling thousands of messages or even tens or hundreds of thousands of messages a day, and those items are being checked by the compliance accelerator and being searched by compliance accelerator, then you may need to, with the other options as well, consider using an index server group. Once again, I just want to reiterate, that we have 2, 3, or 4 of these in conjunction in your environment before you start using index server groups. To try to decide, it may be a little bit easier to actually look at some examples of when you may need to make that conversion or switch over to an index server group. So in this particular example, I have a single Enterprise Vault server. Well, again, one of our criteria for index server groups was to have more than one Enterprise Vault server. So right away, this one doesn't really seem to meet any of my criteria for an index server group. However, I do have both 32-bit and 64-bit indexes. I am going to be using the Enterprise Vault 10 indexing service, as we've shown on a previous slide, to be able to access both the 32-bit index broker as well as the 64-bit index, and that's going to be used in conjunction with the storage service to actually perform the indexing process. In our next configuration example, we now have more than one Enterprise Vault server. We have server A, server B, server C, and server D. All of these have both the indexing service and the storage service on them, making them an all-in-one server. But what I've decided to do in this particular example is that because the only thing I have is multiple Enterprise Vault servers, but wait a minute, I also have a second condition. I'm also doing journal archiving. However, based upon the usage in my environment, I still don't think that I necessarily need to have an index server group. So what I've done is I've set up one Journal Vault store to go to server A's indexing locations. I have a separate Journal Vault store going to server B indexing locations. The third has both journal and mailbox, which is going to server C indexing location. And then that server D is only doing mailbox archiving to go to the index location on server D. Now we've gone to a configuration environment in example 3. I have multiple Enterprise Vault servers. I also am journaling as well as mailbox archiving. I also have an unequal distribution of work between my journal archives and my mailbox archives. So now because I've got basically 3 of my criteria, uneven workload, journaling, multiple Enterprise Vault servers, I've decided that now I may need an index server group. So now you can see in the top picture I've created one index server group called Journal Index Group, and it has index only server 1 and indexing only server 2 in it. In the lower picture I have another index server group named Mailbox Index Group, which has the indexing only server 3 and the indexing only server 4. Once again, I need to associate the index locations and vault stores with indexing servers in order to be able to have indexing occur. So I have my storage only servers, A, B, and C, and D, and the A and B are going to be dealing with journaling, and the C and D will handle my mailbox archiving. For configuration example 4, we're showing you an even larger scaled environment, and in this larger scale environment I'm going to include ungrouped servers as well as indexing only and storage only servers together in an environment. So in this example at the top, it's the same as the previous slide. I have the 2 journal mailbox stores on storage only servers, the 2 indexing only servers in the journal index group. However, in the bottom group, I have an additional all-in-one server for server C and D. They're going to be for the journal vault stores on both of those going to a local index location. However, for the mailboxes, I'm going to take that particular vault store and associate it with the mailbox index group and use the 2 indexing only servers D and E. Actually, that's indexing only servers 3 and E to go to the server 3 and server E locations. And again, those examples were just to try to give us an idea of when you might need to take that crossover from having ungrouped servers to using index server groups. So if I do need to have the indexing, or I understand the indexing architecture, I need to go through and configure the indexing. So the overview for configuring the indexing is to create our index locations, define that Enterprise Vault server cache again, and confirm the index metadata location. This index metadata location is new to Enterprise Vault 10. We didn't have to do that in previous versions of Enterprise Vault. So creating the index locations, once again, we've come back to the indexing service properties page. We've gone to the index locations tab. You click the A, and in this particular example, we have 2 separate locations, one on the D drive, one on the E drive, and we have accepted the default 8 indexing locations. Next, we set up the Enterprise Vault cache location. Again, this is based upon the Enterprise Vault server itself, and you want to specify the location and the size. Again, one of the things that we're doing with this is temporary storage of the indexing service results when you do searches until they can be moved off to the searching application. But also, we've mentioned in a previous lesson how it's used with Vault Cache. The index metadata location with 64-bit indexing, it now requires a location which is going to store some of the core files for the indexing engine and logging data. This location is automatically set, but you can in fact configure it if you need to have it at a different location by opening up the indexing service properties again and specifying on the general tab where you wish to have the index metadata location be. The default path is the installation folder under a folder named EV Indexing, a subfolder Data, and then a subfolder named Index Metadata. If you do in fact use clustering, and we'll talk more in Lesson 15 about expanding our environment with clustering, you need to make sure that the index metadata location is on a shared drive for the clustered enterprise vault servers. Next, configuring our indexing level. It must be set before the indexing begins, because if you set it and then you change your mind later, in order to get the items, if it is a closed index, to have the new indexing level, you will have to rebuild the index, and we'll talk about the disadvantages of doing that a little bit later. You can set it to brief or full. If you do select full, you will also have an option of specifying the preview length, and you can also create a preview for the attachments. You can set up the indexing level at the site level, which will apply to all the archives. You can set it up at the mailbox policy level, which will be assigned to a provisioning group, so everyone who's a member of that provisioning group will get it. You can also open up the individual archive and apply it to an individual archive if you wish. Next is, if you do decide that you need to create an index server group, we're going to go through the basic process for creating an index server group. First, you create the index server group, then you add the Enterprise Vault indexing servers to the index server group, and then you're going to assign the vault stores to the index server group. And again, one of the things we want to reiterate is the importance of making sure that you really want to use index server groups, because some of the configuration settings are not reversible, and we'll be looking at some of those in a little bit later in the lesson here. To add an index server and a vault store to an index server group, you open up the properties of the index server group that you've created. You just right-click down under the Indexes section in the Enterprise Vault Administration Console and say that you wish to create a new index server group, and you will specify a name and a description. And in this particular case, we've named it ISG1. And then we can go through and add the individual vault stores that we wish to add. You have different options here. You can add all of the vault stores that are currently indexed by the servers that you've already added to the index server group, or you can have it use all the unindexed vault stores in this particular site and associate that with the index server group, or you can customize it and go through for individual vault stores and assign them to a particular index server group. So in this example, we only have one vault store assigned to this index server group, which is a general store. Also note down at the bottom, we have two EV servers that are connected to this particular vault index server group, and we've run the connectivity test. And when we run the connectivity test, what that's going to do is verify that these storage-only servers and indexing-only servers have adequate indexing connectivity, because it does use a lot of bandwidth as part of the indexing process and storage process. So you want to make sure that you have a good rating. We talked a little bit more detail about this connectivity test in the Vault Store Lesson 4. So if you want more details about it, you can look at it in help, or you can go to Lesson 4 and look for the connectivity test to get the specifics on what the different ratings are. And also, as a reminder, the connectivity test is using the ICMP protocol, and if your network is blocking that, then you will not be able to see the results of the connectivity test. Now, as we mentioned before, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that you do in fact want to use index server groups. So if you go and start to create an index server group, you will be given a prompt. It's the first one there on the left. It'll say, are you really sure that you want to do this? Because some of the things can't be changed once you have done it. And the next dialog box there in the middle is that if you try to remove a vault store after somebody has been indexed or some item has been indexed in that particular vault store, it will not let you do that. And then it also shows you in the bottom right dialog box that you have the option of, if you try to remove an index server once something has been indexed, it will prevent you from doing that. Now, if in fact you haven't indexed anything in the index server group, you can remove vault stores and index servers from that particular index server group, but you can't do it if it's already had something indexed. Now, once we've decided to set up the indexes and whether we need index server groups or not, we then go through and we have to be able to manage these indexes on a routine basis. So we're going to go through and look at a variety of tools that we can use to gather information and manage these indexes. The list of the tools we're going to look at include the archive properties, index volumes, the index volumes browser, the index volume summary, the manage indexes tool, and the monitoring indexing tasks tool. First, let's look at the archive properties, the index volumes tab. In this particular case here, we've opened up the archive properties for an archive that belongs to Graham Smith. We've gone to the index volumes, and you can see that it will give you a representation of whether or not you have 64-bit or 32-bit indexes. And in this example, we only have a 64-bit index. It will also tell you if it is healthy or if it has failed. There are two buttons on this particular tab that will launch additional tools. If you click on the Details button, it will open the index volumes browser to show more details, and we're going to look at that tool here in a moment. If you click on the Manage Indexes button, it will start the Manage Indexes tool and automatically preload the currently selected archive that you're looking at the properties page for. So if we assume that in the previous example we had clicked on the Details tab, the index volume browser will open up, and you can look at the index volumes for an individual archive or all of the archives using the index volumes browser. You can use the browser to inspect information about the archive, such as the status, the health, and the location. And also we show you a drop down in the upper right there under the actions, and you can select a particular archive and take it offline and make it unavailable for maybe backing up or doing some other maintenance to it. And when you do take it offline, that index will be unavailable for any search, any update, or any deletion. As we mentioned, also, if you do open up the index volumes browser, it can show you a status. In this particular example, we have a couple statuses displayed, online and not yet created. There's actually a total of 4 different statuses that you can see for an index volume. You can have it online, which means that that index is available and fully ready for accepting index items. You can have it as offline, and it will be marked as offline because an administrator has taken it offline. One of the things that you may do is you may have to move an index location. Therefore, the status of that index will have to be offline in order to do that. You may find a status of failed. If the indexing service is not able to go through and access the information in the index locations, it can mark that particular item as failed. And this will prevent the indexing service from continuously trying to access that particular failed volume. And it will go back and recheck it, though, hourly to see if it has whatever was causing the issue has been corrected. And then you have the not yet created. No items have actually been indexed into this particular index volume yet, and basically it's effectively what's called a stub, which is a pointer to a index volume that hasn't been used yet. Another tool that we can use is the index volume summary. The index volume summary provides a site summary that shows you all of the failed index volumes, all of the offline index volumes, the total number of 32-bit index volumes that are in your environment, as well as the total number of 64-bit archive indexes or index volumes that you have in your site as well. Also, you can launch the Manage Indexes tool or the Monitor Indexing Task tool from the Index Volume Summary. Next, we're going to look at the Manage Indexes tool. So if we clicked on the Manage Indexes tool on the previous slide, it would open up this dialog box. This particular dialog box can have one of 5 different options shown. Currently, we see verify, synchronize, rebuild, and change locations. If you had, in fact, done an upgrade and you still had 32-bit indexes that needed upgrading, you could also see an upgrade task as well. We're going to go through in more detail and talk about what each one of these different tasks can do. If I had select verify, the basic architecture of the tool is it will create the actual task itself. Once it's created that task, so in this example, a verify task, we will have an index administration task that will be responsible for monitoring the running of the verify task. If necessary, it will create subtasks. In this example, the index that we're looking at currently has 3 separate index volumes. So the verify task will spawn 3 separate subtasks for that. And then we do have the option of opening up the monitor tasks, which will show you in this case, the verify task, and you do have the availability of actually seeing the subtasks in here as well, and we'll be talking in more detail about the monitoring indexing tasks tool in just a moment. So let's go back and look at what the different tasks do when you are using the Manage Indexes tool. The verify task will generate a report on each index volume based upon the health. It doesn't actually modify anything associated with the actual index. You can run it at two different verification levels, basic or complete. It will mark an index volume as failed if it doesn't pass the checks. And optionally, you can set it up to automatically do a synchronization following the running of the verification task. The actual checks that it's performing is that all the expected index volume files do in fact exist, that the index volumes have been synchronized with storage, and it looks for the existence of any either missing or extra documents in the index volume file location. The next task is the Synchronized Task. It will update any index volumes that are out of date. It's typically used when a verify task reports that something is missing from that index volume location, but it will only fix issues that have already been identified. It doesn't actually go out and do a search for any of the errors that may occur with an index. And if you've used previous versions of Enterprise Vault, this is similar to what was available in the Manage Index Volumes tool for Enterprise Vault 9, the repair functionality. We also have the option to do a rebuild task. The rebuild task will actually retrieve the items from the storage location. It'll rebuild all of the index volumes, both 32-bit and 64. It will convert the existing 32-bit volumes into 64-bit volumes. They will have the following characteristics. All of the old index volumes are alive, which means that they're searchable and they can have things be modified associated with them. They will be placed in read-only mode when it's actually rebuilding that particular index volume. The new index volume will be hidden until the rebuild is complete. You will switch over to the new index volumes, can be based upon a condition or having no errors. You can go through and specify, or you expect to see, fewer index volumes after a rebuild. And again, there can be an issue of once the rebuild is done, is that it will actually take the new index volume, which is a 64-bit index volume, and merge that with the existing or live 64-bit index. And we'll talk about when that can or cannot happen. Typically, rebuilds are very slow, very resource-intensive processes, so you should only use them as a last resort. You may actually want to consider restoring the index from a backup prior to doing a rebuild. And again, remember, as we mentioned first off when we started talking about the rebuild task, that this is actually going to use the storage service and go out and retrieve every single item and re-index it. So these can take a very long time. So you need to weigh that against the time that it would take to restore the index volume from a backup and recover it. Next is the change location task. Periodically, you may need to change the physical location associated with the archive's index volumes in the directory database. So what's happening is because you're moving it to a new physical location, the directory database doesn't automatically get notified because the moving to the new physical location is a manual process. So you need to tell the directory database that the location for the index location is actually changed. And you've got two different ways of doing it. You can actually copy the index locations to its new location first and then run the change location task, or you can run the change location task and then actually move the files. It does require that the new index location exists prior to moving any files, and it requires that the index volumes are set to offline using the tools such as the index volume browser before you start the process of actually moving the physical files. The upgrade task, after we've upgraded from Enterprise Vault 9 to Enterprise Vault 10, we're going to generate or create a new 64-bit index, and all new items that are archived after the upgrade will go into that new 64-bit index volume. The existing 32-bit indexes are effectively frozen, and what I will do is whenever, as we mentioned or shown in an earlier slide, we'll federate a search across both the 32-bit and 64-bit index volumes for any search that requires searching both the 32-bit and 64-bit indexes. I can use this upgrade task, which is part of the Manage Indexes tool, and that particular tool can be used to upgrade the 32-bit index volumes into a 64-bit index if you want to try to minimize the search federation. When it does that, it will in fact retrieve all the items from storage and re-index all the items. The old index volumes will remain live but be placed in read-only mode during the upgrade process. That new index volume will remain hidden until the upgrade is complete, and the switch over to the new index volume can be made conditional based on having no errors. Now note that the upgrade task does not process any existing 64-bit indexes that may be already in play. Now, when you're upgrading a mailbox index, it will then take this new 64-bit index and merge it with the existing 64-bit index that's live. If you're upgrading a journal archive index, it will not merge that live 64-bit index with the upgraded index. So just realize there is a subtle difference between this upgrade task for journal archive indexes versus mailbox indexes. Next, we want to look at some different situations and what we recommend that you do in those situations and a tool that you might want to use to try to fix the problem. Our first situation is that your users report that searches do not seem to be returning the correct number of search results. Run your verify task to confirm if there's any issues, such as missing items, and then if necessary, synchronize the volume to try to have it fix those missing items. If you're using the index volume browser and it shows missing items, you can just run the synchronize the volume. Once again, the index volume browser has determined which items were missing, so that's why you don't have to run the verify first and then the synchronize. If an index volume is showing up as failed on the Archive Properties Index Volumes tab, synchronize that volume first and see if it failed due to missing items. If it didn't synchronize or fail due to just missing items and actually needs to be rebuilt, again, consider restoring the index from a backup or actually running the rebuild task. And again, the rebuild really should be the last resort, and you should have some idea of how long it would take you to do a restore from a backup, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the backup and restoring lesson. But again, know that so that you can make that an accurate assessment on whether or not the restore or the rebuild will be faster. If users are unable to search an archive, see if there's any errors in the Enterprise Vault event logs. If an index is corrupt, then either restore it from a backup or run the rebuild task. If you want to eliminate all of your 32-bit index volumes to reduce that search federation process, you can run the upgrade task, which will rebuild any archives that contain the 32-bit indexes, or you can actually manually run the rebuild, which will also do that. If you're running out of disk space in a particular index location and you need to move some of those indexes to a newly created location, you're going to run the change location task. But again, remember that the process of moving the physical index files is a manual process, and that the change location task is being responsible for upgrading to that new location in the directory database. All of these tasks are being controlled by the index administration task, all the tasks that are run from the Manage Indexes task tool. When you're setting up, you can look at the properties associated with the index administration task, and you can schedule when this runs. By default, this is going to run between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., which is highlighted in blue. And we're having this run so that it doesn't actually run during an archiving task. When we were talking about scheduling your archiving task, we talked about scheduling that at night during off-user hours. But we don't want to be running the manage index tasks while the archiving task is occurring. That just puts too much workload on the Enterprise Vault servers. And you can use the task schedule to control when the indexing task and the subtasks are going to actually run. When you do set up and run the indexing tasks, you may need to keep track of when or how they're progressing. And you also may need to actually go through and use this monitoring indexing task tool to kind of nudge that task through to completion. And this can happen if you've got items that are sitting there with process waiting items, and this will control the switchover for your rebuilds and upgrades. And then you also need to go into the task if you're doing the change location task and let the change location task know that you've actually copied the physical index locations to the new location. You also have the option of opening it up, and this is what it looks like in the graphical user interface. And in this particular example, we're monitoring a verify task on Graham Smith's archive. It shows that there's no missing items, there's no extra items, and therefore there was no errors, and it shows you the progress. If you wish to see additional details about the subtasks, you can double-click on the individual task, and it will open up a window that shows you the subtasks and their current status as well. In this lesson, we learned about how indexing works in an Enterprise Vault 10 environment. We learned the steps required to configure your indexing. We also learned about various tools through the administration console for managing the indexes. For our reference materials, it includes the administration console help, the introduction and planning guide, the installing and configuring guide, as well as the Enterprise Vault Administrator's Guide. This brings us to the end of Lesson 11.